Number 12 is a movie that came out fairly early into the year, and yet, for better or worse, I didn't watch it until the very end of 2024. In the time between the movie coming out and me watching the movie, I had heard a lot of things about how this movie was really bad, and so I guess as a result of that, I wanted to take my gentle time watching this movie. I wanted to wait until the right time to watch this movie, to prepare myself for it, and to see how bad it truly was. And I've gotta say, yeah, it's pretty bad. Y'all were not lying. Number 12 is Kung Fu Panda 4. Now, I spent an entire day binge watching all 4 movies in the Kung Fu Panda series. This feels like a movie where it's like, if I never rewatched the first 3 movies, I would probably like this movie a lot more. I would be like, oh, what's wrong with this movie? It's okay, you know, it's kind of what you would expect from Kung Fu Panda. But it's because I rewatched the earlier movies, and I got reminded of how genuinely great they are, that I cannot look at this as a very good movie. You know, it's kind of the same thing with The Incredibles 2, you know? It's like, Incredibles 2 is fine as its own thing. If you watch it without thinking of the first movie, you're like, oh, this is a good movie. What's wrong with it? Why do people hate it so much? And then you get reminded of how much of a f***ing masterpiece Incredibles 1 is, and then you look back on Incredibles 2 and you're like, yeah, no, they're right, this movie is trash. What the f*** is this? We waited almost 15 years for this. This is what we get? Seriously? Now, before we go over Kung Fu Panda 4, I want to briefly go over the first 3 movies, much like with Despicable Me. The first 2 Kung Fu Panda movies are peak. They are Kino right there. I always felt like there was a shift between DreamWorks before Kung Fu Panda and DreamWorks after Kung Fu Panda. Like, I just don't know how to describe it. I look at the movies they would put out throughout the 2000s and the early 2010s, and it's like, there is a noticeable difference for me between the pre-Kung Fu Panda stuff and the post-Kung Fu Panda stuff. I don't know how I could elaborate on this. It gives me that vibe. There's a difference between the two. I'm sure there were a lot of people that initially dismissed this movie when it was first coming out in 2008. People thought that this was just going to be a stupid, unremarkable comedy made for kids. Now, I have a huge soft spot for a lot of DreamWorks' movies from the 2000s, but I will acknowledge that they're not exactly high art. They're not considered high art. And I want to imagine there were people that thought Kung Fu Panda would be just another one of these movies. This movie would just be a dumb, stupid movie. Maybe not terrible necessarily, maybe not bad, but just largely unremarkable. Just a really unremarkable generic kids movie that'll be filled to the brim with tons of haha Jack Black Panda is fat jokes. And then the movie came out, and yeah, those jokes are in the movie. There are admittedly kind of like lowbrow jokes, you know, haha Jack Black Panda is fat, you know, like those jokes are in the movie. But the movie goes surprisingly much harder than it has any right to. Now, Kung Fu Panda is a comedy. Kung Fu Panda does have comedic moments in it, but there are also a lot of slower, more emotional, serious moments in it, and they're perfectly executed. It never feels like the two are clashing. This movie has both the lowbrow Jack Black Panda is fat haha jokes in it, and it also has a moment like Master Oogway's death that's just absolutely beautiful to watch. Somehow this movie is able to have both of these in it, and it does a perfect job at combining the two. While rewatching this movie, I just paid particular attention to how gorgeous it looked. A lot of the imagery, I would pause the movie, and I would spend a few minutes just taking in the imagery, just taking in the way everything looks. It's a beautiful looking movie. Kung Fu Panda has, I guess you could say by definition, a lot of lowbrow jokes in it, but it also has a lot of surprisingly great action scenes in it. And perhaps even more surprisingly, a lot of beautiful, slower moments as well. You would never expect any of this from a movie called Kung Fu Panda, and yet this is what you get in such a movie. That's why DreamWorks is the fucking goat, man, I'm telling you. It will never not be funny to me the fact that B movie was the last movie that DreamWorks put out before Kung Fu Panda. And it's like, you watch both of these movies back to back, and the difference between the two is night and day. Oh yeah, it's foreshadowing for a later movie on this list. Wink wink. Okay, so you have this movie that I want to imagine people didn't think would be all that good, and then it comes out and it ends up being an unexpected masterpiece. It ends up being largely successful, and just like that, that means a sequel is coming. And guess what? The sequel is great as well. The sequel is amazing. It's very debatable as to which one of these two movies is better. A lot of what I said about the first movie and how great it is, it could also apply to the second movie as well. There are a few lowbrow jokes here and there, and you know, maybe they can be funny, I'm not sure, but I just mainly focus on the great action scenes that are in these movies, and the slower emotional moments that they have. The scene in the second movie where Po is in the abandoned panda village, and he gets that flashback of his mother hiding him in a basket as a baby in order to protect him shortly before she dies, is genuinely one of the saddest moments in any animated movie I could think of. Again, you would never expect to be emotionally moved by a movie called Kung Fu Panda, and yet DreamWorks, the genius bastards that they are, they somehow found a way to make it emotional. Disney could never. Disney could never. And then you have Kung Fu Panda 3, and this is where things go a little bit downhill, I'm sorry. Now, Kung Fu Panda 3 is not a bad movie. Kung Fu Panda 3 is far from a bad movie, but god damn it, is it a downgrade from the first two movies. Kung Fu Panda 3, compared to its predecessors, feels a lot more comedy-focused, which maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing, but, you know, part of what made the first two movies good was that emotional core that they had. When you see people talk about how great the first two Kung Fu Panda movies are, they focus on the action scenes or the emotional scenes. They don't really focus on the comedy scenes. So you have a movie that's more greatly focused on the weakest of the three aspects, and that ends up making the movie weaker than the first two movies. The movie overdoes it with the whole like, haha, the pandas are fat jokes. It overdoes it a little bit more when compared to the first two movies. And eventually, very quickly, it stops being funny. That being said though, there are still a lot of great moments in Kung Fu Panda 3, especially the final climactic battle in the spirit realm, where you get even more of that gorgeous looking animation. And the emotional core that the first two movies had, it's still there in this movie. It's not there as much, but it is still there. There are a lot of things to like about Kung Fu Panda 3, but overall I would consider it a downgrade from the first two movies. The first two Kung Fu Pandas are a straight 10 out of 10. Kung Fu Panda 3 is more of like, I don't know, I guess a 6 out of 10 maybe. It's still good, but if you go into it expecting it to be peak like the first two movies, you're gonna be disappointed. Of course though, when you put it next to Kung Fu Panda 4, yeah, the third movie is peak. The third movie is just as good as the first two movies. Okay, so earlier I brought up how people, when the first Kung Fu Panda movie was coming out, there were likely people that would dismiss it as a generic kids movie, and then it ended up being an unexpected masterpiece. Yeah, Kung Fu Panda 4 is a generic kids movie. Kung Fu Panda 4 is exactly what people feared Kung Fu Panda 1 would be like. Right off the bat, the fact that the Furious 5 are not in this movie is, definitely an interesting decision to make. I gotta be honest with y'all, I knew going into this movie that the Furious 5 had little to no appearances in this movie, and I thought that maybe there was something in Kung Fu Panda 3 that happened that would explain why they're largely absent from the fourth movie, because remember, it had been a long time since I saw the third movie, and I rewatched the first three movies to jog my memory. When I watched the third movie, and then I moved on to the fourth movie, there was just no reason at all. I thought maybe there would be something in the third movie that would explain why the Furious Five are absent from the fourth movie, but no, there's nothing at all. The Furious Five are just absent from the fourth movie, seemingly for the sake of being absent. Instead, the movie focuses largely on Poe and the new character of this movie, Awkwafina Fox. No, I don't remember her name, nor do I want to bother remembering it. I don't care enough about this character to do such a thing, I'm sorry. In a way, though, maybe it's kind of for the better that the Furious Five are almost entirely absent from this movie. Just hear me out. By the time I got to this movie, I started feeling tired of seeing these characters. Again, I understand this is because I binge-watched all of these movies in the span of a day, but watching this movie just made me think, you know, it's okay to say goodbye to these characters. Whatever special qualities these characters had, they're not really there anymore. This movie doesn't ruin Poe's character or anything like that, not to my knowledge at least. You know, he's still the same character that we had in the first three movies, but I think that might be the problem. You know, like the way like Poe describes certain things as being like awesome or epic or whatever, you know, like that was fun for the earlier movies. And then by the time you get to this fourth movie, it's just, you know, it's stale, it's old. I don't know if it's exactly Flanderization, it's probably not that, but it's like, it comes across as more like you're just bored of seeing these characters because it was like they were fun at first. It was fun seeing these characters, but you know, you've seen them a million times and now it's just boring to see them. Something that felt fresh in 2008 and 2011, and to a lesser extent 2016, isn't necessarily going to feel fresh in 2024, especially given how much more dumbed down this movie feels compared to the earlier movies. The first two Kung Fu Panda movies are movies that anyone of any age can enjoy. The third movie feels more like a movie made for kids and only kids, but, you know, adults can enjoy it as well. Anyone of any age could still find some enjoyment out of Kung Fu Panda 3. Kung Fu Panda 4, though, is a kids movie through and through. The emotional core that I brought up earlier is completely gone in this fourth movie. It was there in the first two movies, and it was done perfectly in those movies. The third movie, even though it doesn't have it as much, it was still there as well. In this fourth movie, though, that emotional core is completely gone. The main villain of the movie is this chameleon woman, and it's like, she has the ability to shapeshift, obviously, and, you know, maybe that could be an interesting idea for a villain, but you almost never see her do it. She does it in, like, one scene, I think, and then that's it. The villains of the first three Kung Fu Panda movies are great. They all have backstories, they all have motives, and there are great action scenes with Poe and these characters. And then this chameleon villain in comparison is just, you know, she's got potential to be an interesting villain, and then they just do nothing with her. She barely appears in the movie. Why bother giving this potentially interesting villain such a creative gimmick idea if you're just gonna have her barely appear in the movie? Most of the movie is just Poe and Awkwafina Fox going to this city in order to find the chameleon. And the movie is not funny at all, and it's just really generic and unremarkable. Maybe I'm overreacting a little bit, maybe I'm treating this movie like it's worse than it actually is, but when you look at how f***ing great the first two movies are, you're gonna understand why I think this movie is such a downgrade. Again, if you watch this movie as its own thing, you're probably like, this is a decent kids movie, there's nothing wrong with it. And then you watch the first movie, and you're like, holy shit, this is a masterpiece. What the f*** did they do with that fourth movie, man? And then as it turns out, plot twist, Awkwafina Fox is actually working for the chameleon. And now Poe is sad and depressed and betrayed and whatever, and the two of them split up only to immediately get back together to stop the chameleon. I understand these movies don't necessarily have to be emotional in order to be good, but the emotional moments in the first three movies are part of why they're so beloved. The first two two Kung Fu Panda movies are considered some of the greatest DreamWorks movies ever made, and that's largely because of the surprising emotional core that they have. And even though it's not there as much, the third movie does have its emotional core as well. It's a lot more comedy focused than the first two movies, but it still retains that emotional core a little bit. In this movie though, that emotional core is completely gone, and so what you're left with is a scene that is just so comedically generic when compared to what the first three movies had. It just feels like the generic third act sad moment that a lot of bad kids movies have. You compare this scene to something like Master Oogway's death from the first movie, and it's like the difference is fucking night and day, seriously. There's also this subplot where like Po is forced to retire from being the Dragon Warrior, and so it's someone else that has to take that mantle, which is again a very questionable decision for this movie to make, but you know what, whatever. As long as it's executed well, that's all that matters. The problem is, it's not well executed. As soon as this is established, and as soon as Po first meets the Awkwafina Fox, you already know she's gonna become the next Dragon Warrior. It's like the most predictable fucking thing you could possibly think of. The moment you see these two characters together, you just know, yeah, Awkwafina Fox is gonna be the next Dragon Warrior. Not only is it predictable as hell, but it's also unsatisfying. Wouldn't it make a lot more sense if it was like one of the Furious Five instead? Maybe have Tigress become the next Dragon Warrior? That was something that was established all the way back in the first movie, that she thought she would become the next Dragon Warrior. Oh yeah, I forgot once again, the Furious Five are barely in this movie. It's like they don't exist in this movie. They appear one time at the very end and that's it. I don't care if it would come across as cheap fan service. This movie already lacks a lot of what made the first three movies good. The least it could do is include something that would help redeem it a little bit. The only good thing I can really say about this movie is the animation. The animation, much like with the previous three movies, looks beautiful, but a great animated movie cannot just have great animation. I remember seeing people speculate before this movie came out that like, you know, they were hoping this movie would have like a Puss in Boots The Last Wish-esque art style, which would fit in perfectly for Kung Fu Panda. But honestly, I think it's for the better that such an art style is not in this movie. I mean, that doesn't really matter because the movie does have great animation, but, you know, still, I feel like it would have been even worse to have such an amazing, unique animation style be wasted on a generic kids movie, because that's what this ultimately is. I barely remember what happens in this movie. This movie is extremely forgettable. As I mentioned before a million times, I binge watched all 4 Kung Fu Panda movies in one day. I still remember a lot of what happens in the first 3 movies. This movie though, I can only give you like a few things that I remember from it. Early into the movie, there's a scene where you have all of these animals together in a contest to see who could become the next Dragon Warrior. And then one of these animals is voiced by, no joke, Mr. Beast. Now I remember seeing people making memes of this, people like talking about like Mr. Beast is gonna be in the new Kung Fu Panda movie before this movie came out. Which, it's worth noting, this movie was released before the allegations against Mr. Beast came out, and so obviously we didn't know any better at the time. But I had completely forgotten about that fact that Mr. Beast is in this movie, and so when I started watching the movie for the first time, and I got to the scene that he appeared in, it was like, it caught me off guard. It was like a fucking Five Nights at Freddy's jump scare. All of a sudden I remembered, oh yeah, Mr. Beast is in this movie for some reason. His character only says one line, skadoosh, and that's it. Maybe there's not really much of a reason for me to bring this up, but I don't care. You can't really talk about Kung Fu Panda 4 without bringing up the Mr. Beast cameo, as if there already wasn't enough proof that this movie would age poorly in the future. And then there's a scene much later on in into the movie where Poe and Awkwafina Fox are in the city trying to find the chameleon. And as it turns out, Awkwafina Fox is a wanted criminal in this city. And so you have these two like police officers that catch her, and then Poe tries to rescue her by claiming that like, you know, she's working with him, he's the dragon warrior, that sort of thing. He's like, you don't know who I am? I'm Poe. I'm the dragon warrior. And then it's like the two officers have no idea who he is. And then Poe is like, or better yet, you might also know me as the Kung Fu Panda. I you not, that is an actual line that is said in this movie. In that exact moment, I paused the movie and I'm like, bro, what the hell did they do to this franchise, man? This franchise is so cooked for real. You know, people keep talking about how the Shrek series fell off after the second movie, but I think more people should be talking about how the Kung Fu Panda series fell off as well. Controversial opinion incoming, but I think the downgrade in quality going from the first 3 Kung Fu Pandas to Kung Fu Panda 4 is much bigger than the drop in quality going from the first 2 Shrek movies to Shrek the Third. Sorry, not sorry. I paused the movie, I'm just like, ain't no way he just said that. And it's like, I just started laughing for the wrong reasons. It's such a forced title drop that it made me laugh because of that. So, you know, the movie did make me laugh one time. I'll give it that. Congratulations, DC movie from 2016, whose name I cannot say because I don't want to risk getting demonetized. You no longer have the worst title drop in any movie ever. And then shortly after, there's a scene where Poe and the Awkwafina Fox are running away from the police officers in the city. And then it's like, for whatever reason, an Oriental version of Crazy Train by Ozzy Osbourne is playing in the background, and the first time I watched this, I was like, this completely caught me off guard. I'm watching this scene and I'm paying close attention to the background music and I'm like, wait, this sounds like Crazy Train, what the hell is this? And then I listened to it a few seconds more and it's like, wait, this is Crazy Train, what the hell? I thought this was a song that sounded like Crazy Train, but it actually wasn't. But no, this is a Crazy Train, but it's like an Oriental version. I mean, listen, you know, it's something different, at least, I suppose. Usually when an animated movie has a licensed song, they just play the licensed song normally, and oftentimes it ends up feeling very forced. That Donkey Kong scene in the Mario movie where they have Take On Me just pointlessly shoehorned into the background will never not be cringy to me, I'm sorry. Regardless of how you feel about the Mario movie, you gotta admit, that scene is cringy. And so here you have Kung Fu Panda 4 using a classic 80s metal song, and for some reason they decided to make it part of the movie. They decided to have it fit the tone of this movie, which is, you know, it's brilliant, but it's also really stupid at the same time. Upon the realization that this was indeed an Oriental version of Crazy Train, I just started laughing at it because of just how surreal it was. The only 2 funny moments in this movie, and they're not even intended to be jokes. That should tell you a lot right there. Do I think this movie is worse than Despicable Me 4? Yes, I do, and I'm not ashamed of that. At least with Despicable Me 4, you know exactly what you're getting going into it. If you looked at both of these movies on their own, yeah, you would say Despicable Me 4 is worse than Kung Fu Panda 4. But when you add in the predecessors for both franchises into the mix, and you look at how amazing the first 2 Kung Fu Panda movies were, that's when you realize, no, actually, Kung Fu Panda 4 is worse than Despicable Me 4. A 4th Despicable Me movie being not that good is not really surprising at all, but a 4th Kung Fu Panda movie being not that good is a lot more shocking given how amazing the first 2 movies were. Imagine if someone only watched the 1st and 4th Kung Fu Panda movies. They would be amazed at how much of a downgrade there is going from the 1st movie to the 4th movie. How do you go from unexpected masterpiece that people thought would be a generic kids movie too generic kids movie? That's what I want to know. I'm not gonna lie, all of a sudden I'm not exactly looking forward to Shrek 5 in 2026. Now that I think about it, maybe it's better that we never get Madagascar 4. Then again though, this is a DreamWorks that we're talking about over here, and more often than not, DreamWorks ends up being the GOAT when it comes to animated sequels. So who knows how things could turn out. Maybe this could just be like an unfortunate, like a bad fluke, you know? Kung Fu Panda 4 might be the worst DreamWorks sequel, or at least the worst DreamWorks sequel actually made by DreamWorks themselves, foreshadowing for a later movie on this list. But you know what? It still leagues better than Ralph Breaks the Internet, I'll give it that. The worst DreamWorks sequel is still miles better than the worst Disney sequel. I'll give it credit for that. Alright, I think I've said enough stuff about Kung Fu Panda 4. Let's move on to number 11.